Hello everybody. I would really like to thank Anna for inviting me today and Andrew for his help with the setting up of the computer. And it is a real pleasure to present my work in multimodal discourse analysis. I have worked in this area of research for more than 20 years now, and I'm glad to see that the field has grown considerably in recent years. So my talk today will focus on language variations in ecological discourses on global warming, and I'll show what strategies adopted by scientists and activists to make their discourse more convincing. This is work in progress, so I would be very happy to get your feedback on possible improvements. Here is an overview of my presentation. After a short introduction, I'll present a literature review of salience with a particular focus on gesture and prosody, which are two main semiotic modes I have been concentrating on in my research, and I think that some of you may need this background to understand what follows. When we describe a genre in discourse analysis, what we do is that we consider the salient features of the text we examine, and we'll see in this presentation that the two discourse types I describe feature different types of prominence. After the short literature review, I will describe the expository dimension of discourses on ecology, and I will contrast them with exhortative discourses, which are also very much present under the pressure of rapid climate change. And I will then conclude my presentation. A large part of face-to-face communication is based on what Enfield calls multimodal ensembles or constructs, where information is distributed in different modalities that interact and combine to form gestalts that are both internally complex and compositional. The semantic and pragmatic content in oral communication is conveyed by the verbal modality thanks to the words used and the syntactic arrangements chosen by speakers, as well as by the oral modality, as speakers deliver their messages adopting a particular phonetic production and prosody. The visual modality is also important since gestures and facial expressions play an essential role in communication, but speakers may also rely on images or any kind of visual content that might be provided in the verbal scene by the participants. Speakers communicate the various pieces of information in their messages by selecting the modality best suited to the content conveyed and by articulating the different modalities with each other. The different arrangements of the modalities evolve within a single discourse. In the framework of multimodal discourse analysis, the term interactions has acquired several understandings. It is not only used as a cover term for some kind of dialogue between individuals, but it may also refer to the way the semiotic modes evoked in the previous slide interact in order to elaborate linguistic messages and convey different meanings. Interactions take place in a physical space and social context, which may become more or less salient at any time throughout discourse, as do all of the modalities involved in the elaboration of a linguistic message. This means that elements of context and semiotic modes involved in communication evolve constantly throughout any interaction, and some modality may become more salient at any point in discourse and change the way discourse is perceived by an audience. This is what Sigrid Norris calls modal density. Modal density can be achieved through modal intensity or modal complexity or both, and we will see illustrations of that later in the talk. Modal intensity increases with the increase of the intensity or weight of a mode. For instance, a larger pitch movement or a larger gesture increases the modal intensity at this particular point in time. Modal complexity has to do with how intricate the different modes are at different times. There are times when only speech is in focus, and other utterances that involve gestures, object handling, video projection on background screen, emphatic prosody, and so on. Obviously, these passages are much more complex than just speech. As a result, utterances which are both more intense and more complex show a higher modal density than utterances which are less intense and that involve only one or two semiotic modes. We will see that this is relevant when analyzing political discourses on global warming. So, based on varied video clips collected from YouTube, my talk today will focus on the fact that discourses on global warming are based on two different textual genres, exposition and exhortation. Whereas the aim of expository discourse is to explain the nature and reasons of climate change, exhortation aims at encouraging people to act. This speech style is not necessarily richer in terms of modal complexity, but is certainly sharper in terms of modal intensity. We can therefore say that in between the two genres, there is a shift from higher modal complexity to higher modal intensity, and we will see how the difference between the two types of discourse is expressed in terms of multimodality. Keep in mind, however, that what I'm presenting today is a new development of my previous work and will be limited to a qualitative analysis, since a quantitative analysis would require a lot more annotation work to allow a statistical treatment of the data. Before presenting my analysis of the two discourse genres, I will now give you some background on how gestures, prosody, and speech elements can participate in the perception of linguistic salience, which is directly involved in the way discourse can be perceived as more expositive or exhortative. My analysis of video documents has led me to consider the different levels of salience in each video. This concept has been defined by Landragin as referring above all to the emergence of a figure on a ground, that is, the highlighting of an element in a message. In linguistics, this emergence is due to prosodic, lexical, syntactic, or semantic mechanisms, and its main consequence is the highlighting of an entity, or part of the message, which is thus favored over the ground, the rest of the message and its context, during the comprehension process. To this definition, one can add that gestures also contribute to the perception of part of the message as more salient than the rest. The first thing to be noted concerning gestures is that their mere presence supposes that the speaker has selected and highlighted some elements in speech. However, there are different ways to do so. The physical features selected by co-verbal gestures acquire a certain prominence due to the schematic nature of the gestures made by speakers, as Mittelberg explains. She says, so, while physical in nature, gestures often emerge as rather schematic gestalts that, as such, have the capacity to vividly convey essential semantic and pragmatic aspects of high relevance to the speaker. As a way of highlighting certain features of objects or more abstract notions, people can perform representational or non-representational gestures. Here are different gesture types following the descriptions of David McNeill and Adam Kendon, the founders of the field of gesture studies. There are three different types of representational gestures. Iconic gestures give a visual representation of some object or action. For instance, if you form a ball with your hands to illustrate a round object. Metaphoric gestures represent an abstract concept, as when, for instance, you depict a scale with both hands to illustrate the notion of justice. When gestures have become conventionalized to the point that they are understandable without speech, they form the category of emblems. One illustration of this is the OK thumb up gesture. Speech is also regularly accompanied with non-representational gestures, which were also called pragmatic gestures by Adam Kendon. These gestures don't represent aspects of reference, contrary to the ones on the left of the slide. Some of these non-representational gestures highlight the structure of discourse or speech turns. This is the case of flips of a hand at the beginning of discourse units to introduce a new point, but also hands closed into a fist or coming in contact at the end of discourse units. Some gestures, like the palm up open hand gesture or pure gesture described by Cornelia Müller, may serve the expression of stance in an utterance, and by this I mean the way speakers position themselves both towards the audience and towards the content of their discourse. Other non-representational gestures are more directly linked with the expression of salience. This is the case of beats. These gestures regularly accompany prosodic emphasis, although it has been shown that they may express emphasis themselves without any prosodic salience. Pointing gestures have been shown by Edelin and Klinkenberg to be linked to the expression of emphasis as well, but whereas beats serve to highlight some part of speech, points highlight some part of space or some concrete referent in that space. I have shown in a paper that will hopefully come out soon that beats and points share quite a certain number of features, one of these being that they can be added to another gesture, so one gesture may have several dimensions, as stated by David McNeil. For instance, you may point towards somebody with the palm up open hand gesture shape, which gives the pointing gesture a nuance of offering the speech turn, which is not present if the point is performed with the index finger. Beyond the production of gesture type, gesture size, of course, participates as well in the perception of salience. A large gesture is generally perceived as much more salient than a smaller version of the same gesture. I have shown in a previous study that large hand gestures may even induce the perception of prosodic salience when there is in fact absolutely no emphatic stress in speech. Speakers may also use other bodily movements to emphasize speech. They may raise their brows as a way to indicate special emphasis on a word. They may also adopt certain facial expressions to emphasize modality in speech, for instance. They can also perform head shakes and nods as a way to emphasize discourse items. Emphasis may also be present in speech under the form of specific prosodic constructs. The largest part of our linguistic messages is uttered in what is understood as broad focus. In broad focus, the whole utterance is considered as relevant in the activation state of listeners. Broad focus is generally marked in statements by a regularly decreasing pitch and intensity, a final falling tone, and the last syllable of the utterance is usually longer too. This is the type of focus that we have in the following utterance illustrated in this Pratt screenshot, the speech analysis software that I use in my research.
We hear about it causing climate change. We hear about it causing climate change.
This utterance is composed of a single intonation phrase, and the last lexical item in the utterance carries the nuclear accent on the first syllable of the compound word climate change. And this stress is perceived as the most important one in the phrase. It corresponds to the part highlighted in pink in the figure. It starts slightly higher in pitch than the preceding stress on the first syllable of causing, and the pitch movement is slightly larger. You otherwise see that both pitch and intensity decrease regularly throughout the utterance. This is the default intonation contour for statements, and it means that the whole utterance is considered as relevant in the meaning making of the speaker. On the contrary, in narrow focus, only part of the linguistic message is considered as relevant in the activation state of listeners. There is some emphasis on this particular part of speech, which is characterized by some earlier boundary tone, higher intensity and pitch, and the syllables under focus are generally lengthened, especially their onsets. This type of focus can be contrastive or just emphatic, although some scholars consider emphasis as some form of implicit contrast. Here is an example of narrow focus.
But the truth is more nuanced than that. But the truth is more nuanced than that.
In this example, the speaker emphasizes the word truth as highlighted on the Pratt screenshot. This word is perceived as more salient than the rest of the intonation phrase. The default pattern in broad focus would have assigned the nuclear accent to the first syllable of the word nuanced, which is the last lexical element in the phrase, but this is not the case here, as some extra prominence has been assigned to the truth that is going to be delivered by the speaker. Here we've seen an example of prominence achieved by higher pitch, higher intensity, and longer syllable duration, but there are other possible means of emphasizing some part of speech. Speech rate and tempo may also be involved, as we will see later in the talk. Salience, as we've seen, can be present in gesture and prosody, but it can also be present in speech itself. There are many different ways speakers can achieve emphasis in speech, but the most studied ones are syntactic, semantic, and discursive. In syntax, Lambrecht distinguishes different sentence forms that can be used in the expression of focus. Among these forms, we count dislocation and topicalization, which may be used to introduce or reintroduce some verbal referent, cleft and pseudo-cleft sentences that are used to select a referent in a set of options, and presentative constructions. These are syntactic structures which present or introduce an entity, bringing it to the attention of the addressee. Emphasis can also be conveyed in speech with the use of scalar adverbs like extremely or modifiers like most, but also at the interface between semantics and syntax when one changes a word or rephrases a sentence, especially when this is not linked to hesitation phenomena. Some discourse tropes like hyperbole or metaphor will also convey some emphasis. One point that is important is that salience may be expressed in speech, in prosody, or in gesture, but it may also be expressed in a multimodal way, although this is not necessary and most of the time not the preferred option in ordinary conversation, as I showed in a paper published in Speech Communication. This means that when salience is expressed in several semiotic modes at the same time, for instance, salience expressed in speech, in prosody, and in gesture, then the modal density in this speech part is very high. I am now going to describe the expository discourse on ecology that used to be frequent when people began to be concerned with global warming and they had to explain why it is important that we take action soon. Expository discourse can be described as a subgenre of pedagogical discourse. I say subgenre because pedagogical discourse, of course, includes explanations, but is far from limited to this activity. Expository discourse is used to explain, describe, or give information. Exposition is a discourse encountered in textbooks, classroom lectures, technical papers, or documentaries. With this form of discourse, the speaker assumes that the listener has no or little prior knowledge or prior understanding of the topic that is being discussed. Because discourse on global warming involves scientific processes, it is natural that people who want to warn nations against the effects of global warming have recourse to this genre, which I find very often in my corpus. Resorting to scientific explanation gives more credibility to the diverse calls to action. It includes the use of numerous examples and explanations of processes and systems. This type of discourse was described by Niepel as including more low-frequency words or rare words and more complex syntactic structures than other discourse types. This explains why I found sequences in which speakers rename and define products or concepts quite often in the genre. I also found that expository discourse is close, prosodically speaking, to pedagogical discourse and is frequently uttered with greater emphasis on the beginning rather than at the end of essential phrases, in contrast to the prosodic pattern of spontaneous speech, for example. Multimodally, this discourse genre frequently relies on visual resources like slideshows, maps, and so on, and speakers regularly perform mediated actions. In mediated action, a speaker may use a smaller scale model to illustrate his point, for instance. As far as skilled verbal gestures are concerned, this discourse genre includes three types of gestures in particular: discourse organization gestures, pointing to the visual support where appropriate, and iconic representational gestures, which illustrate the verbal content in speech and may even complement other types of visuals. To illustrate the characteristics of expository discourse mentioned in the previous slide, here is an example of a TED Talk presentation on global warming.
It's not an exaggeration to say that a threat to the ozone layer is a threat to human safety. And actually, ironically, it was human safety that motivated the invention of CFCs in the first place. You see, in the early days of refrigeration, refrigerators used toxic and flammable chemicals like propane and ammonia.
So in this example, you see that the sentences used are complex ones, but the particular feature to be noticed here is a constant use of technical vocabulary with words like ozone layer, propane, or ammonia, to quote just a few items. There are also acronyms in this discourse genre, like CFCs in this example. The use of technical vocabulary that was illustrated in the previous example of the same speaker leads to numerous renaming and rephrasing processes, as is the case here with the acronym CFC.
And third, CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, man-made chemicals that were used as propellant in aerosol spray cans.
The acronym is first rephrased with the technical term chlorofluorocarbons and is then given a more accessible definition with man-made chemicals that was used as propellant in aerosol spray cans. You note that the technical term chlorofluorocarbons does not add any easy-to-understand explanation to a lay audience. It, however, gives the speaker's talk a more scientific dimension. As I said earlier, expository discourse is also frequently associated with what are called mediated actions. This is the case when discourses are based on some kind of artifact used by the speaker, as is the case of the video on top of the slide, in which the speaker makes a short experiment to explain why the level of oceans has risen. The experiment consists in heating water to see how its level rises in a test tube.
As we warm this water, it expands.
Here, the speaker also makes an iconic gesture to accompany the expansion of the water mentioned in speech. He projects his hand forward in an opening movement to physically represent the expansion. There is also an artifact used in a second video on the slide.
My fear is not that Earth will fall over a cliff on the 1st of January 2030. My fear is that we press unstoppable buttons in the Earth system.
In this video, the visual material is different from the usual visual support that is used most of the time in presentations. Here, the visual support is used as if it were a concrete 3D artifact in a sort of pretend action made by the speaker of pushing the Earth over a cliff. He also makes another iconic gesture as he performs the action of pressing an imaginary button, which also seems to exert an action on the video on the screen behind him. Here is another video where the artifact is an Earth globe, which is used by the speaker to explain ocean currents. Let's have a look at this.
The ocean works in a similar way. In the Atlantic, you have the Gulf Stream going up the coast of North America. It gets colder as it gets closer to the poles. Colder air is denser. It gets saltier as some of that water on the surface freezes, and that also makes it denser. And that denser water sinks down into the depths of the ocean and then goes along the ocean floor back towards the equator.
Since speakers rely quite a lot on either an object used as an artifact or on some visual support, there are quite a lot of pointing gestures towards these visual supports. As shown by Harrison, these points are essential to the construction of meaning in TED Talk conferences, and this certainly applies to other types of presentations in which the same expository goal is present. Some of the points in this video are static, when others are more dynamic, which means that some points actually refer to a particular space location, whereas other points trace lines to follow different spatial directions. At the end of the video, the speaker also performs some iconic gesture to represent the movement of denser water in the depths of the ocean. So in the clips, the artifact is not conceived of as offering a standalone representation of the concepts explained. What is shown with the use of the artifact is also represented in a somewhat more symbolic way with gesture performance without the artifact. We are very close to pedagogical classroom discourse in these videos. In expository discourse, speakers also perform frequent hand flips. We have two examples of this hand gesture in these two excerpts.
It gets colder as it gets closer to the poles. Colder air is denser.
In this example, the hand flip signals some justification for adding the fact that whereas the speaker was describing water density is now mentioning colder air, thus explaining how the Gulf Stream underwater affects air masses above ocean level. The hand flip is slightly skewed because of the presence of the globe, but its prototypical form is generally more horizontal. Alan Sienke has described several forms of the hand flip, some of which are more reduced versions than others. One of these multifunctional gestures rules is to emphasize a new point in discourse. This addition is also expressed in speech in the second example on this slide with the use of also.
It gets saltier as some of that water on the surface freezes, and that also makes it denser. And that.
Let's have a look now at the prosodic shape of utterances uttered together with gestures. In this video clip, quantity is expressed with two iconic gestures that emphasize the words enormous and little bit.
So you get this enormous ocean just a little bit warmer.
In terms of prosody, enormous and little are lengthened and pronounced with rising-falling intonation contours, as you can see on this screenshot from Pratt. The two lengthened speech parts and variation in pitch contour participate in emphasizing the two words which become more salient than the rest of the utterance.
This enormous ocean just a little bit warmer.
Now that we've seen examples of the expository genre, we'll see some discourses on global warming have a more exhortative dimension. Exhortative discourse, or exhortation, is defined by Black as a genre of discourse in which the evocation of an emotional response in the audience induces belief in the situation to which the emotion is appropriate. It is a subgenre of persuasive argumentative discourse. It is found most frequently in sermons as well as in activist discourse, and it aims at urging recipients to act or at justifying courses of action. In the material I've been looking at, I find that exhortation is expressed in speech content by more frequent recourse to hyperbolic speech and contrast, but also of metaphoric language by speakers. Sentences are generally shorter than what we find in expository discourse and used in the paratactic style, which means that clauses are juxtaposed without any expression of conjunctions. The use of modals must and can is much more pervasive than other modals like should or could. I also find that beat prosody is more frequent in this type of discourse in which all the words may carry some emphasis. Prosodic beats are regularly accompanied by beat gestures, while contrasting viewpoints can be expressed in hand gestures being performed in different parts of a speaker's personal space. We've seen previously that in the case of expository discourse, speakers may use mediated actions, like using small-scale experiment resources to convey the meaning of the explanation and establish parallels between the smaller version and events in the real world. In the case of exhortative discourse, however, speakers perform more symbolic direct actions. This slide shows a series of screen captures from YouTube which reveal several hyperbolic and metaphoric images that have been going around on the net about global warming. While some videos simply describe extreme weather, others go further, referring to the apocalypse and announcing the death of all by 2030. As the ice of the Arctic is melting faster than was first expected, the planet is metaphorically represented as a giant ice cream cone, and global warming is considered as a ticking time bomb. After years of what we should do to reduce global warming, or what we could do to improve life conditions, the new motto of the ecological debate has changed to what we can or must do in face of the numerous threats. These modal auxiliaries have been used more and more often in political discourse concerning global warming. Metaphor is not only present in speech, it may also have some representation in gesture, as in this example, although this is not very frequent.
The amount of carbon that goes into the carbon cycle comes back out again. It's all a closed loop.
I play this one again.
The amount of carbon that goes into the carbon cycle comes back out again. It's all a closed loop.
Here, the speaker illustrates the carbon cycle with two metaphoric gestures in the vertical plane, as he first makes two circular gestures that both represent the abstract concept of a cycle based on the common graphic representation of a cycle loop with circular arrows. He finishes with another circular gesture performed in the horizontal plane to illustrate a loop. The first two gestures also accompany speech uttered at a very fast speech rate compared with the rest of his talk and without any pause. This also contributes to the metaphoric representation of a loop and is evocative of fast trains in roller coasters. Hyperbole is considered in the literature as an exaggerated statement or claim not meant to be taken literally and which is generally not considered as a lie. The use of the word bludgeon in the example on this slide has a metaphoric meaning as it compares argumentation to some kind of fight in which an argument can be used as a weapon. Yet the mention of the term bludgeon, which is quite a low-frequency word, as well as the gesture performed by the speaker, acquire some hyperbolic dimension.
So we're going to use climate change as this bludgeon for economic redistribution. Okay.
In the second example from the same talk show, another speaker is mimicking the extreme positions adopted by supporters of both theories concerning climate change, and he does this in quite a hyperbolic way.
It's not like it's right or wrong or it's a binary choice where it's do nothing, nothing to see here, don't do anything, versus stop everything you're doing, this is the number one issue, we're all going to die. There has to be some nuance here.
As he opposes extreme scalar quantifiers like nothing, everything, and all, He also performs large gestures supposed to report some enactments by believers of both sides of a theory. The size of the gestures, which is also amplified both by the contrasting spaces where they are performed in front of the speaker's body, as well as by louder speech, participate in the impression of exaggeration. The type of contrast we've just seen in the previous slide is frequently established by speakers in their speech to strengthen their argumentation. The expression of contrast doesn't mean that the arguments presented by speakers are antithetical, as was the case previously. They can also reveal an additional nature. This is the case in the example on this slide where the speaker opposes every company's business model to every country's nationally determined contribution.
But we need more, because there is a lot of warming that we can prevent if we quickly deploy the full set of affordable and available strategies. We need standalone methane targets as part of every company's business model and every country's nationally determined contribution as the Paris Agreement is strengthened.
You see that this contrast is achieved with two presentational gestures in opposite directions, one being performed on the left of the speaker and the other on our right. These two directions represent two levels of action, a local one and a more national level, each level of action being incomplete without the other. In this other example, the same speaker proposes two series of contrasting presentational gestures. The first one associates communities and ecosystems and therefore establishes a parallel between the needs of human beings and the needs of nature. The second one establishes a contrast between two opposite natural elements, fire and water.
This would help communities and ecosystems adapt to a changing climate and hit the brakes on worsening extreme events like wildfires in the Americas and Australia and flooding in Europe and Asia.
You notice that the last two gestures opposing wildfires and flooding are much more ample than the first two gestures she performed and are therefore more salient. Beat gestures are particularly pervasive in argumentative discourse and extremely frequent in political discourses. They participate in the rhythmic structure of utterances, as is the case in this example.
This number could increase to 120 to nearly 200 gigatons of avoided greenhouse gases.
So the speaker here makes a first pointing gesture towards the screen on his left, and while holding this gesture, he also performs a series of beats on the stressed syllables of his speech. You see in the A-line screenshot, where the gestures have been coded, that in this very short extract, there is only one beat during the first intonation phrase. This number could increase, but the following intonation phrases are accompanied by 2 to 3 beats in superposition with a pointing gesture, which means that gesture density is much higher on these utterances than on the first. Some of the beats represented here are also quite small, but others are much larger, like the beat performed in synchrony with avoided. Numerous and larger beats have an effect on how intense speech is perceived. However, the strengthening effect of beats is perceived as even more effective when beat gestures accompany speech pronounced with what is called beat prosody. Here is an example on this slide of beat prosody.
There is only one option. I repeat to you, only one option left to climatologists and scientists, and that is to do the unthinkable.
What you see in this video is a speaker who performs a certain number of beat gestures as he speaks, most of them with his hands, but he also performs a beat with his head at the end of the clip. At some point, his speech is also divided into shorter intonation phrases than what we would normally expect, as shown in this Pratt screenshot.
Only one option left to climatologists and scientists.
The features of beat prosody is that there are frequent pauses between short intonation phrases. You also see that pitch in blue and intensity in green are equally high on all the stressed syllables of the rhythmic groups, except in the last one, and scientist. This is normally not the case in ordinary speech, in which pitch and intensity decrease progressively throughout what can be considered as an oral paragraph. Here is another example of beat prosody in a speech by Al Gore in the US. Note how the passages of beat prosody are accompanied by beat gestures when the speaker is visible on the screen.
Every piece of pro-climate legislation, the oil and gas industry and the coal industry, they come in and fight it tooth and nail. And they use their legacy network of political influence and wealth to stop progress. The rest of us have to reform these international institutions so that the people of this world can say, we are now in charge of our own destiny. We're going to save the future and give people hope. We can do it, and remember that political will is itself a renewable resource.
As you can see on the Pratt screenshot below the video, Al Gore splits his utterance into small intonation phrases, 3 of which are iambic in structure. Iambs are metric feet that consist of a weak syllable and a stressed one, which is here strongly accented.
We are now in charge of our own destiny.
Each iamb of the speaker is uttered on a flat tone with very little difference in pitch between stressed and unstressed syllables, which are also pronounced quite loudly. In each iamb, the last syllable is also much longer than the first. These 2-beat rhythmic pattern, present both in speech and in the accompanying beat gestures, gives his speech a chanting nature which makes it more convincing and participates in the feeling of exhortation. Beat prosody is also present in the last video I would like to show you. Here, the young lady also adopts some form of beat prosody with more accented syllables than would normally be found in ordinary speech.
We cannot afford new oil and gas.
The accented syllables are pronounced with high pitch and flat tones, apart from the 2 following tones visible in the Pratt screenshot on cannot and gas, which are located at the beginning and the end of the utterance.
We cannot afford new oil and gas.
These strong prosodic beats are accompanied by beats of the torso of the young lady who's holding a can of tomato soup. This video has also shocked some people in the world, as the declaration is immediately followed by direct action when the young lady throws the soup on some artwork. This type of action is of course not new in activism, and we can think of the numerous actions taken by Greenpeace and other such organizations, but it seems to me that we have recently witnessed a renewed interest in mediatic actions concerning global warming. I will now briefly conclude this presentation. What I hope to have shown today is that global warming has been the subject of 2 completely different discourse types. The first type of discourse is expository in nature. Its structure is complex in the verbal semiotic mode, with complex sentences and use of less frequent lexical words. Speakers also emphasize the important elements in speech and accompany their descriptions with mediated actions and representational gestures, besides points and beats. In the exhortative genre, we've seen that speakers frequently use metaphors and hyperbole in speech, and sometimes in gesture as well, although their sentences are less elaborate, syntactically and lexically speaking. Their intonation is, however, more marked, with chanting prosodic patterns and use of beat prosody. As a parallel to what happens in speech, gestures are also less varied, with the use of hand flips, points, and beats mainly, and less representational gestures. Beats especially are much more frequent and can even be performed with other body parts like head or torso. Actions are not mediated ones, but real symbolic actions in the environment. This means that both discourses are equally dense in a multimodal perspective because they are conveyed through different semiotic modes like gesture, visual resources, and object handling as well as prosody. Yet, there has been a shift from a more complex discourse in the expository genre to a more intense discourse in the exhortative genre, with more emphatic speech as well as prosodic patterns, gestures, and actions. What we've seen together in this presentation are simply two different ways to convince people that some action is required facing the urgency of global warming. I thank you for your attention and would be very happy to answer any questions.